Imagine this, a vast, desolate forest where the trees stretch high into the sky, their branches bare from the chill of winter. The air is sharp with cold, and the earth is blanketed in a thick layer of snow, untouched by footprints. But amidst the stillness, a faint sound echoes through the woods, an agonizing, heart-wrenching cry. It's the cry of a wolf cub, lost and alone. The little creature stumbles through the snow, its small body trembling, fur matted and dirty. Its bright eyes are wide with fear, searching desperately for something or someone. The cub's cries are not just for attention, they are a call for help. Deep within the forest, far from the warmth and safety of human civilization, this young wolf has been separated from its mother. The wilderness can be a harsh place for a lone cub, and the bond between a mother wolf and her young is unbreakable. But now that bond has been severed, leaving the cub vulnerable, confused, and in need of compassion. Would you believe such a thing could happen? A creature, wild and untamed, left to fend for itself? But sometimes, even the most resilient beings face moments of weakness. What would you do if you found this innocent creature crying for help, stranded in the heart of the wilderness? The wolf cub's cries cut through the frozen silence of the forest. Every call sounded more desperate, more broken than the last. With each step, the tiny creature sank deeper into the snow, its paws trembling with the cold, its fur weighed down by the freezing droplets that clung to it. The cub's small body was exhausted from wandering in the harsh wilderness, the soft whimpers punctuating the loneliness that surrounded it. It had been hours, maybe even days, since it had last seen its mother. The forest was its home, but it was also a place of great danger, where survival meant everything. As the cub staggered forward, its limbs were weak, its stomach empty. The wilderness had become a battlefield for it, and it was losing the fight. But then, in a moment of hope, the cub paused, its ears flicking toward a distant sound. Was it a voice? Or perhaps a footstep? The cub's heart beat faster. Was it another wolf? A chance to be reunited with its pack, its family? Or perhaps it was the sound of danger, something worse waiting in the shadows. Fear gnawed at the cub, but instinct pushed it forward. Meanwhile, across the forest, a couple of human figures had been on a routine patrol, unaware of the life-or-death struggle unfolding nearby. They were used to the silence, to the cold, but even they could feel that something was different today. The wind had a harsher bite, and the sky had grown darker, as though it too sensed the desperation in the air. The couple, Sarah and Mike, had spent years living on the edge of the wilderness. They had seen many things, but nothing quite like this. As they trudged through the thick snow, Mike's eyes caught something in the distance, a small dark shape against the whiteness of the landscape. At first, he thought it might be a trick of the light, but as they got closer, his heart sank. It was the cub, barely able to keep itself standing. Sarah's breath caught in her throat when she saw the cub. It was clear that it wasn't just lost, it was in pain. Its fur was matted, its body thin, almost skeletal. The wide, terrified eyes locked with Sarah's, pleading without words. She felt a pang of sympathy, but the reality of the situation hit her like a wave. A wild animal, especially a wolf cub, was no small thing to handle. They were strong, unpredictable, and potentially dangerous. But there was no denying the suffering she saw before her. Mike instinctively reached for his rifle, his hands trembling. They were trained for emergencies like this. Wolves were common in the area, but a cub alone in the wild was a different matter entirely. What if the mother was nearby, watching, waiting? The thought of facing an enraged mother wolf made him hesitate. His mind raced, torn between caution and compassion. Sarah, however, couldn't look away from the cub. It was a helpless creature, struggling against forces beyond its control. She took a tentative step forward, her voice soft, trying to calm it. "It's okay," she whispered. "You're not alone. We'll help you." Mike glanced at Sarah, his eyes filled with concern. "Are you sure we should get close? What if the mother's out there?" Sarah paused, her heart pounding in her chest. There was no way to know for sure, but she couldn't leave the cub out there. It was too small, too fragile to survive on its own. Mike's fear was palpable, but something in Sarah's steady gaze told him that this was the right thing to do. "All right," he finally said, putting the rifle down. "But we need to be careful. We don't know what we're dealing with." With the tension hanging between them, Sarah crouched down slowly, lowering herself to the cub's level. It stopped its crying for a moment, blinking up at her with cautious curiosity. She reached out a hand, her movements slow and deliberate. For a brief second, she thought the cub might run, but instead, it took a step closer, as if instinctively recognizing her gesture of kindness. "It's okay," Sarah repeated, a soft promise. She managed to gently touch the cub's back, her fingers brushing against its fur. The moment their touch made contact, a wave of relief seemed to wash over the little creature. It let out a quiet whimper, a mix of exhaustion and gratitude. But as Sarah knelt down, a deep, low growl suddenly echoed through the trees. Mike's hand shot up to grab her arm, pulling her back with urgency. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, his face pale. The growl was unmistakable. The mother wolf, sensing the presence of humans near her cub, had arrived. The air was thick with tension. Time was running out. Would they be able to protect the cub and themselves if the mother decided to attack? Every muscle in Sarah's body tensed, but she didn't move. She couldn't leave the cub. The distant growl came again, louder this time, more threatening. Sarah looked back at Mike, her eyes full of determination. There was no turning back now. But in her heart, she knew this wasn't just about saving the cub. It was about a connection, a bond that transcended the wildness of the forest, a bond that could only be understood through compassion. The growl of the mother wolf echoed again, louder this time, sending a shiver down Sarah's spine. Mike instinctively pulled Sarah back a little, his eyes scanning the trees for any sign of movement. The cub, meanwhile, seemed to sense the danger. Its small body trembled even more violently, and its tail curled between its legs as it looked up at Sarah with wide, frightened eyes. For a long moment, neither Sarah nor Mike moved. They both knew that the situation was growing more dangerous with every second. The mother wolf was nearby, just out of sight, but the growls were unmistakable. The forest was thick with tension, and it was clear that the cub's life hung in the balance. Sarah's heart raced. She could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on her. Could they leave now and risk the cub's fate? Or should they try to help it? The question churned in her mind, but in her gut, she already knew the answer. There was no choice. She couldn't just walk away. Taking a deep breath, Sarah looked at Mike. "We have to try. We can't leave it here." Mike hesitated, his eyes still darting nervously toward the trees. "But we don't know what we're dealing with here, Sarah. If the mother decides to attack—" "We won't let that happen," Sarah interrupted, her voice firm, though her hands trembled slightly. "We need to show her that we're not a threat." For a moment, Mike's fear seemed to overpower his concern for the cub. But seeing the determination in Sarah's eyes, something inside him clicked. He slowly nodded, stepping back to give her more space. "All right, but you need to be careful. I'll be right behind you." With her heart pounding, Sarah crouched down even lower, her eyes never leaving the cub. "It's okay," she whispered again, her voice full of tenderness. "We're not going to hurt you." Then, she made a bold decision. She extended her hand toward the little creature, palm open, trusting that the cub would understand. The air was thick with tension, but there was a quiet moment where everything seemed to hold its breath. The cub hesitated, looking between her hand and the shadows beyond. And then, almost as if guided by some deep instinct, it took a slow, cautious step forward. Its tiny paws pressed against the snow as it drew closer, its eyes locked on Sarah's hand. For a brief moment, Their gazes met, and something unspoken passed between them, a recognition of shared vulnerability, of desperation. The cub nuzzled her hand softly, a small sound escaping from its throat, a mix of fear and longing. The warmth of Sarah's touch seemed to offer a fleeting sense of safety, but as the cub grew closer, the growl of the mother wolf reverberated through the trees once again. This time, it was closer, much closer. Sarah could feel her heart in her throat, but she didn't pull away. Then, in a flash of movement, the mother wolf appeared from the shadows, her eyes glowing fiercely in the fading light of the day. She was beautiful, yet terrifying, her coat thick and wild, her muscles coiled as if ready to spring at any moment. She stood at the edge of the clearing, watching them with suspicion, her body tense and alert. The cub froze, its small body stiffening. For a moment, time seemed to slow. The mother's gaze locked on Sarah, and everything else in the world disappeared. There was only that gaze, raw, unrelenting, full of protective instinct. Sarah's breath caught. The fear she had felt earlier returned with full force. The mother wolf was now so close, so near, that Sarah could see the faintest glint of white teeth in the fading light. It was a moment where everything could go wrong. But Sarah didn't flinch. She kept her hand outstretched, her voice barely above a whisper, but steady. "We're here to help." For what felt like an eternity, the mother wolf simply watched her. The air was thick with anticipation. Mike stood still, his eyes never leaving the wolf, ready to act if things went south. Then slowly, almost imperceptibly, the mother wolf took a cautious step forward. Her gaze never wavered from Sarah, but she didn't charge. Instead, she nudged the cub with her nose, guiding it closer to Sarah's outstretched hand. In that moment, something extraordinary happened. A bond was formed. An understanding passed between them. Sarah, feeling the weight of the situation, knew this was the mother wolf's way of entrusting her with the care of her young. It was an act of pure, raw trust. Without a word, Sarah gently scooped the cub into her arms, holding it close to her chest. The cub let out a soft sigh, its body trembling less now, comforted by her warmth. The mother wolf, eyes still watchful, took a step back. She remained within sight, but she seemed to understand that Sarah wasn't a threat. It was a silent agreement, a moment of action and trust that would change everything. The cub was safe, for now. And Sarah, Mike, and the mother wolf shared a brief, unspoken understanding. Sometimes, even in the most uncertain of situations, compassion could bridge the divide between human and animal. The snow continued to fall, thick and steady, as Sarah cradled the wolf cub against her chest, its tiny body still shivering. The mother wolf remained a few paces away, her eyes never leaving Sarah. It was a quiet, tense standoff in the heart of the forest. But for a brief moment, the fear that had gripped Sarah's heart seemed to fade. She held the cub close, her breath steady, knowing that her act of compassion had created a fragile truce between her and the wild creature before her. They made their way back to their cabin, Mike keeping a careful watch on their surroundings, his rifle still close at hand, though he didn't feel as much danger now. Sarah's thoughts were on the little cub in her arms. It was no longer making those heartbreaking whimpers, but it was still trembling, its body weak and cold. Inside the cabin, Sarah gently placed the cub on a soft blanket by the fire. Mike immediately began preparing some food, heating up water to soothe the cub's body. They both worked in silence, their focus on the tiny creature that had become the center of their world. Sarah's fingers trembled as she examined the cub more closely. Its fur was matted and damp, and it looked undernourished, with visible signs of exhaustion and stress. As she gently wiped the snow from its fur, the cub's eyes fluttered open, blinking in confusion. It looked up at Sarah, with that same gaze, fearful but full of trust. It was as if the cub knew that it was safe, that it had found someone who would care for it. Sarah leaned down, her face inches from the cub, her voice soft and comforting. "Shh, you're safe now," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. She could feel the weight of her words, as if she were not just comforting the cub, but also herself. The journey to this point had been uncertain, filled with fear and danger. But now here they were, together, in this small, humble cabin. The cub was no longer alone. Mike looked on from across the room, his eyes glistening with emotion. He had been a part of this rescue, this incredible act of trust and kindness. But seeing the cub finally resting in safety, its body no longer trembling, moved him in a way he couldn't put into words. He had never thought that something as wild as a wolf would ever allow itself to be cared for by a human, yet here they were, in a moment of unexpected tenderness. As the hours passed, the cub grew quieter, its breathing steadier. Sarah's heart swelled with relief, but there was still a lingering sense of responsibility. She knew that the cub couldn't stay here forever. The mother would come for it, she had to. But the idea of sending the cub back into the wilderness, knowing the dangers it might face, filled her with a deep sadness. She had become attached to this tiny creature, to its fragile existence, and the thought of losing it again seemed unbearable. Yet, as the fire crackled softly in the background, something amazing happened. The door of the cabin creaked open slowly, the cold night air rushing in. Sarah and Mike both froze, their eyes darting to the doorway. And then, there she was, the mother wolf. She stood in the doorway, her eyes glowing in the dim light of the cabin. Her body was tense, but there was no aggression in her stance. Instead, it was as though she was waiting, watching, ensuring that her cub was safe. The room seemed to hold its breath. Mike, standing silently behind Sarah, instinctively reached for his rifle, but Sarah gently placed a hand on his arm, signaling for him to hold still. Sarah slowly stood, keeping her eyes on the mother wolf, who had stepped into the cabin with careful, deliberate steps. Her fur was thick, her presence powerful, but there was a gentleness in her gaze that made Sarah's heart skip a beat. The cub, still nestled in the blanket by the fire, stirred at the sound of its mother's presence. Its ears perked up, and it let out a soft whine. The mother wolf's eyes locked with her cub's, and for a moment there was a pause, an exchange of understanding. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she watched the reunion unfold before her eyes. The mother wolf moved toward the cub, her movements graceful and fluid. She nuzzled the little one gently, nudging it with her nose, as if to say, "It's all right now. You're safe." The sight was breathtaking. It was a bond that went beyond words, beyond anything Sarah could have imagined. She had helped save this tiny life, and in return, she had witnessed something profoundly beautiful, an act of love, of trust, and of the resilience of the wild. Sarah stepped back slowly, not wanting to disturb the reunion, but her eyes filled with tears as she watched the mother wolf nuzzle her cub one last time. The love and gratitude the mother wolf showed, though silent, were clear in her every action. The cub, once weak and vulnerable, now had a chance because of the bond between them, because of the kindness shown in the most unlikely of places. Mike, too, stood in quiet awe, realizing that this moment had changed him. It wasn't just about survival or the wildness of nature. It was about the capacity for love, even in the most unexpected situations. Finally, with a last lingering look at Sarah and Mike, the mother wolf turned and began to walk back into the forest, her cub following her with careful steps. As they disappeared into the snow, Sarah's heart swelled with emotion. She had done what she could, and now the wolf family would return to their world. It was a sight that moved Sarah to tears. In that moment, she realized that even the wildest creatures, those that lived beyond the reach of humans, were capable of love and gratitude. And as she stood there, watching them disappear into the night, she understood something profound. Compassion had bridged the gap between their worlds. And, for a brief moment, the wilderness had opened its heart. As Sarah and Mike stood together, watching the mother wolf and her cub disappear into the snowy wilderness, a quiet sense of peace settled over them. They had been part of something incredible, an experience that had forever changed their understanding of compassion, trust, and the bonds that can form between humans and the wild. What started as a moment of fear and uncertainty had transformed into an unforgettable act of kindness. The tiny cub, once trembling and vulnerable, was now safe, reunited with its mother in the wild where it truly belonged. It was a beautiful reminder that even in the most unexpected of circumstances, compassion could bridge any gap. As Sarah gazed out into the forest, she knew that the story of this cub would stay with her forever. It was a story of resilience, of healing, and of how even the smallest act of kindness can have the power to change everything. It was proof that, no matter how wild or untamed the world may seem, love and trust could bring hope where there was once only uncertainty. This experience had taught them both something they would carry with them always, that even in the harshest conditions, even when the world seems distant and cold, the capacity for love and kindness remains. And sometimes, all it takes is one brave act to set things right again. In the end, the wilderness had shown them its heart, and in return, Sarah and Mike had shared theirs. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like and share. Together, we can spread the message of compassion and remind the world that even the smallest acts of kindness have the power to change lives. Let's inspire others to connect, to care, and to make the world a little warmer, one act of love at a time. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey.